Just a second.
Okay.
Just a second. Yes, now.
Okay. Okay. Thank you all for joining in today. This meeting is organized by the Teachers Against the Climate Crisis, which is a non-funded, non-party organization that we set up about a year ago. And its purpose is essentially to deepen understanding and engagement among teachers and students in particular. The term crisis in our name, and there are many reasons why we do that. So one of them are the rising emissions that have happened and in fact intensified in the last 30 years. So if you look at the last 30-year period between 1990 and the present, carbon dioxide emissions, including deforestation, have been rising. They were about 26 billion tons in 1990, including deforestation, mind you. That rose to 29 billion tons in 2000, 38 billion tons in 2010, and about 43 billion tons last year. And as you know, there's hardly been a dip any year, barring in 2009 before this one. As earlier talks have discussed, underlying this rise are systemic factors: the spread of capitalism, urbanization, growing inequalities, and fiscal and other state policies that promote consumption by the better off. So rather than tackle these structural factors, a number of elites have pushed for technological solutions. There are many, some of which are welcome, like solar. Some of them are premature, and some of them are downright dangerous. Among these is nuclear power as a non-fossil fuel energy source. And this argument for nuclear power as a solution to the climate crisis has been pushed by political leaders, across the political spectrum, by writers, and by scientists who ought to know better. But is nuclear power really an answer to the crisis? So we couldn't have a better person to answer that question today than Professor M.V. Ramana. So he is the director of the Leo Institute for Global Issues at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. He's also the author of The Power of Promise, Examining Nuclear Energy in India, which is out by Penguin Books. He's a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials, of the International Nuclear Risk Assessment Group, and of the team that brings out an annual report for the World Nuclear Industry Status Report each year. So before I pass it on to Ramana, I'll just say that the structure is roughly such that he'll speak for about 40 or 45 minutes, after which we'll open it out for questions, comments, and observations. Thank you, and thank you once again for joining in, and thank you, Ramana, for joining at what is an unusual time for you. I realize it's 9:30 p.m. there. Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Naga. Thank you all for joining me. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you all. I'll start by sharing my screen. I hope that you can all see my screen. Yeah, okay. So I'll start by sort of pointing out something that we've been seeing, as Naga mentioned, in the last few years, actually maybe a couple of decades at this point. Nuclear power has had something of a second wind, thanks to the climate crisis. And I thought this cartoon sort of captures the dual structure of the arguments that nuclear advocates sort of talk about. On the one hand, this is actually a cartoon from the 2007 IPCC report, but on that same cartoon sort of also captures how nuclear power advocates talk about it. On the one hand, they talk about how dangerous climate change is, but at the same time, it's also gives an opportunity for them to present nuclear power as a solution. So very briefly, why would anybody talk about nuclear power as a solution? And the simple answer is that nuclear reactors involve little or no burning of fossil fuels. There is a debate on the quantity of carbon emissions from the complete nuclear fuel chain, including uranium mining and enrichment, and et cetera, et cetera. This has been a sort of fairly complicated debate, and there are a very large range of estimates for how much carbon dioxide emissions come from these different steps in the nuclear fuel chain. And there was about a dozen years ago, Benjamin Sovacool had a kind of a comprehensive literature review where he showed that there is the range of numbers that come up. It goes from about 1.4 grams per kilowatt hour to about 200 grams per kilowatt hour. Just to put that in perspective, coal might be of the order of about 1,000 grams per kilowatt hour, or 1 kilogram per kilowatt hour. Now, if you dig deeper into these estimates, what you find is that some of the small estimates are either not very comprehensive, in other words, they leave out some steps in the nuclear fuel chain, or they assume conditions very specific to particular conditions, particular countries. So in the case of Sweden, for example, it's one of its large utilities, Vattenfall, had a estimate which is among the lower ones. And Sweden has traditionally had a electricity industry that was largely dominated by hydropower and nuclear power. And so its emission levels for electricity production there is very, very low. And so Vattenfall's numbers also come out to be very low. On the other hand, very large estimates assume either poor uranium ore grades or technologies that are not necessarily used anymore. And so there's the range sort of reflects also a bunch of assumptions there. But nevertheless, what I would say is that, I mean, neither of these estimates are going to be likely for both all over the world. But the bottom line, I think, is that nuclear power should be considered to be a low carbon source because it's only a small fraction of fossil fuel sources. And there's a discussion about whether this is more than renewables or less, and I don't think we really need to get into that. But the bottom line, I think, to repeat, is that I think one should not get into the debate of whether nuclear power is not a low carbon source. I think that's not a very good argument to make. Okay, before I get into the question of whether nuclear power should be considered to be a solution to the climate crisis, I want to sort of start by addressing something that Naga asked, which is, who's making the argument? So there are, many of the usual suspects are there. Political leaders around the world have talked about how nuclear power is a good solution to climate change. And this includes people like Macron and Modi and so on and so forth. And I will sort of come back to this a little bit later. Then there are a whole bunch of agencies that who are in the business of promoting nuclear power, including nuclear industries, of course, but also international organizations like the OECD's Nuclear Energy Agency and the International Atomic Energy Agency. Naga mentioned that there are some climate scientists who have sort of talked about it, most prominently the person on the extreme left in this picture, Jim Hansen. And Jim Hansen wrote a whole book called Storms of My Grandchildren, where he made a very strong case for nuclear power. And that's, of course, not the only place where he's talked about it. There are sort of various problems with Hansen's specific advocacy for nuclear power, which focuses on a particular kind of reactors called integral fast reactors. I have written a whole article for Mawsum, the newsletter that Naga used to, or I think continues to bring out, which sort of deals with this thing, and I'm not going to go into that. But just to say that I think in the case of Jim Hansen, though one considers him to be a really good climate scientist, on the question of trying to examine critically the technology that he's promoting, he's done a pretty poor job. But just to say, in his book, Jim Hansen sort of talks about how he came across this, which is interesting, which is that somewhere along the way, he met this guy called Tom Blees. And Tom Blees had written this book called Prescription for the Planet, where he says, there are these three technologies. One is nuclear power, of course, one is a kind of a solar cell, and one is kind of a storage technology. And Tom Blees's argument was that once you have these three technologies, then we can essentially painlessly solve climate change, all right? And I think we'll come back to this point, but I think this idea that you can painlessly solve climate change is the fundamental driver for many people to promote nuclear power. And then there are also people who are sort of in a way worse, which is the so-called eco-modernists, who have been extremely prominent in many debates, and they have said, for example, that nuclear fission today represents the only present-day zero-carbon technology with the demonstrated ability to meet most, if not all, of the energy demands of a modern economy, and therefore nuclear power is their solution to climate change. among the people who were members of this eco-modernist collective at that point, there's Mark Linus, who's a fairly prominent journalist, who in one of his books said, anyone who's opposed to nuclear power is essentially a villain, like a big oil company. And Michael Schellenberger, who's also been a very controversial, I would say, supporter for nuclear power, and whose most recent book actually says, a lot of climate change, concern about climate change actually amounts to alarmism. And the final example I'd give is George Monbiot, who made a fairly prominent call for expanding nuclear power after the Fukushima accident. He many of his arguments, unfortunately, were based on a bunch of reports produced by the United Nations Scientific Commission for the Effects of Atomic Radiation, the historian Kate Brown, whose book on Chernobyl, which came out last year, it's an excellent book for those people who have not read it, talks about some of the tactics that were used by the United Nations Scientific Commission for the Study of Effects of Atomic Radiation, and basically talking about how they have undermined health risks of Chernobyl. Anyway, so this is a kind of a quick overview of the kinds of people who are talking about nuclear power and also talking about it very prominently. Behind the scenes, of course, there are a large number of corporations who are all the time promoting nuclear power for reasons which I will get into later. Okay, so the question which comes up at the end of this is, should we expand nuclear power to solve climate change, right? Before I sort of get into that, I just want to just segue for a very brief minute to say, talking about solving climate change is inherently a problematic question because of something that people have talked about for some years now, which is the idea of something called a wicked problem. These two policy theorists wrote in a famous article in 1973, where they said there are some problems which should be characterized as wicked because of a set of problems with even the definition of the problem, right? And I don't want to sort of go into that because people have talked about this at great length, in particular Mike Hume, who argued that, the kinds of solutions which people have been talking about, what he called elegant solutions, don't really solve these kind of wicked problems. And one example he gives is that of, how environmental economists would use some kind of a cost-benefit calculation and settle on a carbon price, impose a carbon tax, and say that this is going to solve the problem. The kind of nuclear power is a similar sort of elegant solution, which really is not going to work. But that said, for the purposes of this talk, let me just give you a scale of what this means, what it means when people say nuclear power can be a solution. So one way that people have tried to quantify this is to use things called integrated assessment models. I'm not a big believer in these models because of the kinds of assumptions that go in and the problematic nature of some of those assumptions. Still, I'll give a number from a calculation that my former colleague Alex Glasser carried out to just give you a sense of how much nuclear energy is needed. And what these calculations show is that nuclear power ought to be somewhere around, oh my God, this is not, should be of the order of about 910 gigawatts. And to give you a sense of how much that should be, okay? All right, so that's the to give you a sense of the scale of how much nuclear power is required. In order to sort of explain why I think nuclear power should not be considered a solution, I want to divide my discussion into two sets of concerns first. The first is what I would call the question of desirability, right? And there are three sets of basic arguments why one might say that nuclear power is not a desirable solution to climate change, regardless of whether it can be or cannot be, right? These are what are, I think, the most familiar to most people. This is what many people would give as their reason. One of these, typically, or all of them, is the reason that many people would say, this is why we don't think nuclear power should be expanded or should be used as a solution to climate change. So the first problem is that nuclear energy is capable of severe accidents. This is something which has been demonstrated many times, most dramatically in the case of the Chernobyl accident of 1986, where the radioactive contamination from that accident spread out over very large spaces. There are still very large parts of Ukraine and Belarus and Russia which are still uninhabitable, sort of showing that the contamination from this accident has spread out not just across space, but even across time, in the sense that we are now nearly 35 years past that accident, and we are still, there are people who are living with the consequences of that radioactive contamination from that accident. So one thing that immediately comes up when we talk about accidents is, maybe that was a problem with that specific reactor. Can other reactors be safe and accident proof? And there are sort of a set of reasons why this is going to be extremely difficult. The first is that nuclear power plants, as Chick Perot taught us many years ago, is a very complex technology. And in a complex technology, it's very hard to envision all possible accident pathways. And if you don't know a particular pathway, then you cannot set up a safety system to protect against this particular accident sequence. The corollary of that is that when people make assessments of how risky a particular technology is, what is the chances of an accident with the kind of reactor that's being constructed, let's say Kudankulam, or which is being constructed in the state of Georgia in the United States, those assessments are all unreliable because people cannot possibly foresee all possible failure modes. The second is that there are a whole bunch of other conflicting interests among people who are involved in regulating, in promoting nuclear power, and so on, which make it harder to ensure that reactors are operated in ways that minimize the probability of an accident. In any case, the bottom line is that the probability of an accident at a nuclear plant will remain uncertain, but certainly greater than zero. So there's no such thing as safe nuclear power. All nuclear power plants will have some risk of an accident. It's a matter of one's opinion, as well as presumably some democratic process that has to be undergone before we decide whether to build or not, given this risk. And I just want to say that because you're talking about in the context of climate change, it's quite likely that the risk of accidents is probably going to go up as a result of the climate change, as a result of global warming. Just in the last 2 days, there was these news headlines, which I just sort of thought I would capture in order to show you how this is an alive problem, which is that nuclear reactors are facing problems because of increasing climate variability, right? So in France, a nuclear reactor had to be shut down because the water that's used to cool the reactor, which comes from a nearby source of water, had become too hot. And in the state of Iowa, one of the reactors was damaged, and they decided not to restart that nuclear plant. Okay, so that's, I think, something to remember. The second set of problems with nuclear power, why it's undesirable, is that it is closely linked with nuclear weapons. So the first reason, the technical reason why that is the case, is that all nuclear energy production involves the use and production of either enriched uranium or plutonium, both of which can be used to make nuclear weapons. And even a small nuclear plant has large requirements when you think about the quantities in the context of how many nuclear weapons can be made, right? The third problem is that I should note here that even though I say this is a problem, this can actually be quite an attractive feature for some other actors in this game, and I'll come back to that later. The third problem is that nuclear power produces radioactive waste that remain hazardous for millennia, for the time period that it takes for the radioactive waste, the spent fuel from a nuclear reactor, to actually decay into to levels of radioactive releases that are comparable with uranium, which is the material that is mined out of the earth that is going into most of these nuclear reactors, runs to about a few 100,000 years. So that gives you a sense of the scale of this. And there are sort of technical challenges which have to do with how to ensure any kind of system that can be expected to last that long, plus a whole bunch of social concerns that people have had about trying to bequeath this kind of a intractable problem to their descendants. And so as a result, there are no operating nuclear waste repositories anywhere in the world that deal with waste from commercial nuclear power plants. The result of many of these is that nuclear power has largely been unfavorable to members of the public. And people who have studied this argue that that the most importantly, Paul Slovic has said that nuclear power is the technological hazard with the most negative and most problematic constellation of traits, which makes it extremely hard to get consent from people all over the world. And this is something we saw in the aftermath of the Fukushima accidents in 2011, when around the world there were protests that took place, kind of bringing out people in opposition to nuclear power. The second set of problems with trying to consider nuclear power as a solution to climate change do not have anything to do with the desirability. We might argue that nuclear power is undesirable, but climate change is even more undesirable, and therefore we might agree to decide to build nuclear power plants. But the second set of arguments against considering nuclear power as a solution have to do with the feasibility of trying to use nuclear power to mitigate climate change. And there are sort of two sets of problems here. The first is that if you think about how much nuclear power we have and what trends there are. So at the moment, there are about 442 reactors operating in about 31 countries. I say about 31 because the International Atomic Energy Agency includes Taiwan in the list of 442, but not as a country. And what you should see when you look at this particular distribution is that most of these nuclear power plants are concentrated in just a handful of countries. The vast majority of countries that have built nuclear plants typically built one or two reactors and then have essentially given up on that quest. There are, of course, the vast majority of the countries in the world have never built any nuclear plants. So that's the first thing to remember. These reactors were built in two waves, essentially. The first wave was in the 1970s, which was largely in the United States. And then the second one peaked in the 1980s, largely in Western Europe. And then essentially after 1986, which is Fukushima, the wave of construction essentially died down or reduced drastically. And what you see is that in some years, there are more reactors that were shut down than started, right? The net result is that, and I should say that, this is also includes the so-called nuclear renaissance that people were talking about since the beginning of this century. And what you see is that there was a small wave of construction that happened, which kind of peaked around 2012, 2013, mostly because of what was happening in China. And that's a big story, which I don't think I have time to go into right now. But that's something which I'm happy to go into in the Q&A. These reactors take a very long time to build. Typically, the average is about 10 years, roughly speaking, right? But sometimes these can go on for decades. And the result of all these trends is that if you look at nuclear energy as a share of all electricity generated around the world, what you see is that the share has been declining consistently since the mid 1990s. The highest it ever was in 1996, when it reached a fraction of 17.6%. Since then, it's come down to about roughly 10%. Even under the most optimistic projections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which has sort of vested interest in projecting a growth in nuclear power, what you see is that nuclear power can at best hold market share. And just to sort of put this in this graph in perspective, even the upper end of the IAEA's projections for the year 2050, the latest sort of set, is just about the 900 gigawatts of nuclear capacity. But that's the most optimistic that they can come up with. And as you can see, that optimism has been sliding in the last decade. So it's very unlikely that actually these kind of very optimistic projections are ever going to come to pass. So even in the most optimistic circumstance, although I must also add that nuclear power pretty much maintains market share, right? So that's not actually a very good sign for a solution to climate change, because ideally what you would want to have is that particular source of energy is expanding its reach into the electricity markets and taking over market share from fossil fuels. And that's not happened with nuclear power. So why is this trend? This trend is, the answer is very simple. Nuclear power is not economically competitive. Reactors cost too much to build, right? So the numbers on this vary from country to country. I'm going to show you some numbers from the United States. This is by a Wall Street company called Lazard Corporation. And every year, Lazard sort of looks at all the energy plants that are under construction in the United States and tries to average all of these things. And what you find is that nuclear is among the highest. In fact, in the last year's numbers, it was the highest in terms of both the construction cost, in other words, the cost per unit of generation capacity, as well as the generation cost, that is the cost per unit of electrical energy that is consumed or fed into the grid. In comparison with other sources of energy, as we all know, wind and solar and so on have become far cheaper, right? And the cost trends have been that renewables have been dropping, whereas nuclear power has the somewhat unfortunate historical record that as we get more experience with nuclear power, costs have actually gone up. And the way to think about it is that as you have had more experience with nuclear power, what you realize is that reactors can have multiple ways of failing, of opening up into accidents. And once regulators and the industry realizes that there is a vulnerability, you would have to try and fix it, which increases the cost of constructing reactors. So that's one way to understand why nuclear reactor costs have gone up. There are a bunch of other reasons which I don't want to get into, but the most important point is that it's not likely that nuclear power is going to become any cheaper in the future, right? In comparison with other places. The third thing which I want to say why countries and utilities have been a little wary of nuclear power to some extent is that there's a financial risk, especially with people who don't necessarily own nuclear plants but are in the business of trying to lend nuclear plants. So Wall Street, in particular in the United States, has been very wary of sort of supporting nuclear power construction because of what happened in 3 Mile Island in 1979. The sort of lesson was well captured by Peter Bradford, a former nuclear regulatory commissioner. The other financial risk associated with nuclear power has been that of cost increases. So there's been a consistent trend that initial cost estimates of almost all nuclear plants tend to be much lower than what the final cost actually turns out to be. And this has been true across countries, across time periods. And here are sort of some of the numbers for among the most recent reactors that have been constructed or are under construction still. Last thing which I want to say is that one of the trends which has been happening in the last decade is that an old story about nuclear power used to be that nuclear power plants are expensive to build, but once you build, they are actually quite cheap to operate because they require very little uranium in comparison with something like coal or natural gas, where the cost of fuel drives the cost of supplying electricity from these power plants. In the case of nuclear power, it's really the cost of the constructing the plant, the capital cost. But once you've done the construction, the claim used to be that reactors were good profit-generating investments. In the last decade, that has changed completely. And what's happened is that a lot of old nuclear plants essentially have shut down because they are now faced with competition from both renewables and natural gas in the case of the United States, where the natural gas typically comes from fracking. And in these, this happens particularly in those electricity, in those countries or those parts of the countries where electricity is sold on a market instead of giving guaranteed contracts. So through what's called restructuring or electricity sector reforms in many countries since the 1990s, the electricity has become a commodity, just like bread or like laptop computers. And basically, anybody is allowed to sell their source of electricity on a market. And in those kinds of market situations, nuclear power has had a particularly tough time. So these are this is the second set of reasons why nuclear power is not going to be a good solution to climate change. So it's not desirable for a bunch of well-known reasons, and it is not feasible that nuclear power will expand fast enough or that will actually be a good investment or a sort of prudent investment if you're thinking about solving climate change. Okay, so if I had been a sort of a smart person, I would have probably stopped here, but I'm going to sort of go on and talk a little bit about sort of the political economy of nuclear power, or why nuclear power is still considered a solution to the climate crisis, right? And so I'm going to start by putting out a few counter arguments to all of this. In a way, I'm going out of my comfort zone, and I'm going to make life a little bit more difficult for myself. But I think I would like to explore some of these arguments, and I hope you'll bear with me for a somewhat unfinished and incomplete set of arguments, which are probably not the best laid out. Okay, so the main counter arguments to all the points that I mentioned so far is one, new nuclear technologies are the answer. All the problems that I've mentioned, people would say, have been with old nuclear power plants. There is now a new generation of nuclear reactors that are being built or which have been under development, and those things will not have any of these problems. The second, as I kind of alluded to earlier, is that the climate crisis is more undesirable than all the problems with nuclear power, right? And the third argument that sometimes we hear is that if only we had the political will, we can overcome all of these problems. Okay, I'm not going to try and counter each of these issues, but I'm going to just sort of mention a couple of counter arguments. They're not necessarily direct counters, but the first one is something which I think is fairly easy to sort of address. So, can new nuclear reactor designs change this picture? And the simple answer is that we have seen throughout history that nuclear reactor vendors have been making claims about how their technology is going to solve all the problems associated with nuclear power, right? So a typical claim is one, for example, made by Westinghouse, the company that is responsible for the majority of the fundamental pressurized water reactor design that is at the root of most of the nuclear plants around the world. I mean, more than half of the nuclear plants. Now, after more than 5 decades of experience with nuclear power construction, Westinghouse's latest design is called the AP1000, and this was built in China. is being built in the United States. And when Westinghouse was developing this design, it used to make these kinds of claims that, by using modular construction methods, never mind what that means, but these kind of fancy jargon terms it would use to say we will be able to build the AP1000 in 36 months. Most of the AP1000s in the construction have taken double, maybe much more than that. And the reality has been that all of these so-called modular construction methods and all the other problems, that all the other solutions that Westinghouse had proposed as their way to address all of the problems with nuclear power construction turned out to be problems themselves, right? And similarly with all of these so-called small modular reactors, this is the sort of latest buzzword in the nuclear industry, where they say, oh, these are all problems of the old ones. If you build small reactors, we can do it in factories, and all of these problems will go away. A lot of our research has shown that this doesn't actually work in practice. In fact, many of these will have problems which are worse in some ways compared to larger reactors. So, the idea of that, somehow new technology is going to come and solve climate change's problems is, I think, wishful thinking, essentially, and is best captured by this quote from The Great Gatsby, where, somehow next time around, everything is going to work out. And if you just, have faith in them, they're going to do that. And I don't think that's really going to happen. Okay. The second thing which I want to say is, in order to get back to the question of, is this really a solution to climate change? I want to ask the question, are all of these people, especially the people who are in power, who are either in the position of making big decisions or putting in money to build nuclear power, are they doing it because of climate change, right? It's one thing for Jim Hansen or George Monbiot to say something, because they're not going to actually build a nuclear reactor. They're not going to be able to make a decision to build a nuclear power plant. They can come and do propaganda for this. They can make arguments for it, but they're not actually the deciders. The question really is whether people who are deciding are doing this because of climate change. And the answer is, if you look at many of them, there's a lot of hypocrisy. I kind of given you the examples of, Narendra Modi early on, and you all know what Modi is doing with respect to climate change in India, and his support for coal and so on and so forth. But actually, the poster child for this is Donald Trump, right? Trump sort of soon after he came to power, he increased the amount of subsidy that was extended to nuclear power plant construction in the United States. But, as we all know, Trump is not necessarily a believer in climate change, right? So something else is the reason why he is pushing for nuclear power. It can't be climate change, right? But even somebody like Obama, who's a big believer in climate change and who did say that he was increasing investment in nuclear power because of climate change, was also somebody who would do huge amounts of investment in fossil fuels, which is not something which you would expect someone who's really believing in climate change to be doing, right? And you all probably may have seen this famous quote. He said that under my administration, America is producing more oil today than at any time in the last 8 years. We've added enough oil and gas pipeline to encircle the earth twice over and some more, or something along those lines. So then, the idea that many of these people are doing it because of climate change is something we should treat with skepticism. Are there other reasons why they may be doing it? And I think there are a bunch of other reasons why they may be supporting nuclear power, which again makes it suspect when you ask the question of whether nuclear power can be a solution to climate change. So one argument that I have made in the past, and others have also talked about, is that nuclear power has the great attraction to people who are in political power or who are seeking political power, because it can promise both nuclear energy, energy for quote unquote development or for manufacturing and so on and so forth, as well as nuclear weapons for security, right? This is the claim the Department of Atomic Energy has made, and something which I explored in my book, The Power of Promise. But it's also interesting that typically the nuclear industry would say, look, you guys are confusing stuff. We are really about generating electricity, and we want to do a good job of it. And we are not, you're trying to confuse us with nuclear weapons, right? And many nuclear advocates say that. For example, Ted Nordhaus, one of the signatories of the eco-modernist what is it called, the manifesto, and the founder of one of the major institutions which is pushing for nuclear power, Breakthrough Institute, had argued that this is a confusion that people have, that nuclear power somehow is related to nuclear weapons, right? What is ironic is that in the last few years, as leading countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, as the nuclear industry was in trouble, when they had to find government support subsidies in order to even start construction of nuclear power plants and to maintain the ones that are finding it unprofitable in electricity markets, they immediately bring out this argument that nuclear energy should be supported because it is a key national security enabler. That's the terminology of Ernie Moniz, who used to be the Department of Energy Secretary under President Obama. And likewise, in the United Kingdom, the argument for building and subsidizing the Hinkley plant in the UK was that you would need that expertise to build the next generation of Trident nuclear submarines. And likewise, a student of mine has looked at the connection between the Brazilian nuclear submarine program and their uranium enrichment program and the plans for constructing nuclear plants under Jair Bolsonaro. Another reason why many of these countries sort of push is geostrategy, right? So many of these countries like China, like Russia, like the United States have tried to export nuclear power plants to countries in order that they can try to win support within those countries to establish certain kinds of strategic relationships. Another reason why I think, so now I sort of want to turn a little bit to the private sector, which is sort of more interesting partner, because I've made this argument that nuclear power is very expensive and therefore and is not profitable. So the obvious sort of puzzle that this, or the question that this raises, is why are private companies, which are supposedly seeking profits, why are they going into this? And the answer is very simple, that the problems that for us, including the problem that these are unprofitable, are not problems for them, right? What you find is that most of this nuclear power plant construction and other activities surrounding nuclear power are carried out under situations where the costs and the risks are socialized, in other words, externalized to the taxpayers or the customers for electricity, while the profit is privatized. And this, and many of the times, this is the only time when, for example, in the United States, in the last decade, nuclear power construction started was when Obama expanded loan guarantees. And I sort of put an arrow here to point out when he made this announcement, which was 5 days after the accidents at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant started in March 2011. In both of these cases, what happened was, this is the nuclear construction in the United States. Many reactors were constructed, or at least the construction was started, but the ratepayer, and then eventually the cost of these reactors went so high that the construction was actually canceled, right? And the project was scrapped. But this was all the costs that have been incurred in that. Much of it was passed on to customers in those states, even though they are never going to see any electricity from these reactors. What has become a typical pattern in the United States and many other countries, the executives who were responsible for the decision to build the reactors, have it go hugely over budget, were paid off with millions of dollars in bonuses, right? one of them recently actually pled guilty and became farmer. In the other project, the state of Georgia, you can see here the picture of profits for the utility that was building the nuclear plant. Right? Their the year that the Georgia legislature passed a tax that allowed Georgia's small businesses and residential electricity consumers to pay for construction of the plant. So in other words, this number is being on the hook paying for these. The liabilities for these costs or for any possible accidents and so on are also passed on to consumers, the taxpayer. So this is something which we saw in India between roughly 2009 and 2015, and that the debate over the liability for operators who are operating reactors and supplies. This, and I'm happy about that. Lastly, I want to say, okay, I mean, these are sort of the last issues I want to mention is that if you look at all of the different utilities and governments that are doing it, they're also involved in fossil fuel energy, right? And if you look at, so this is some calculation that a student of mine did based on data from one of these big databases. And what we looked at was, if you look at utilities that own nuclear plants in the United States and how are they doing relative to other companies that have power plants which are not necessarily nuclear plants, which could be or cannot be, what you see is that almost all of the utilities which have nuclear plants are doing far better in terms of their overall market capitalization, how much of the market they own. The sort of line in the bottom with the numbers is the median for all power plants. And the line that you can almost not see right in the bottom is actually the median for all the plants, all the utilities that own no nuclear plants. So in other words, owning a nuclear plant is actually quite beneficial to the overall market capitalization, but this is not because they are necessarily profitable on some fundamental grounds, but because the political reality is that they are able to siphon off money and pass it on to their stock owners. So the bottom line is what you see in many of these nuclear power holding companies is the sort of best exemplified by this cartoon that came out many years ago, which said, you know, even though things are going to be really bad in the future, and we can see it before the end actually comes, there's unprecedented opportunities for profit. And that's what I think nuclear power really represents for most of these people, right? And so those people who are most responsible for creating the problem of climate change, as Arundhati Roy explained, will see to it that they profit from the solution that they propose. And nuclear power is one such solution. Okay, I want to sort of end with just leaving us with the question of what does it mean to be an answer to the climate crisis? And I think in order to sort of explore this question, we have to ask ourselves, can we actually meet the climate crisis? Can we do anything about the climate crisis within the context of an economic system that believes in constant expansion, right? And that economic system is evidently capitalism. Under capitalism, of course, there is no concept of a stable, stationary capitalism. Capitalism, by its very nature, has to keep expanding, and expansion means an increase in the amount of material resources that's going to use and the amount of energy that is going to use. And within this context, there is going to be no way to solve climate change because all these activities are going to be essentially imposing a burden on the earth, right? This is something which actually is quite obvious to most people. We live on a finite planet. You cannot have infinite growth. But in order that the system remain unquestioned, I think one of the ways by which the system has tried to react to criticisms of capitalism from people who are concerned about climate change is to say that we have these magic answers to climate change, and one of them is nuclear power, right? And nuclear power is really good in to many of these people who want to think about it that way, is because they think that they can solve the problem without really changing the system in any deep or meaningful fashion, right? And this is, I think, the larger context. I don't want to sort of give a long talk on this, but I wanted to leave you with that thought, and then just sort of end with reiterating some of my main messages. So the first point is that I think nuclear power as the way to mitigate climate change brings other problems. The issues which I mentioned about the risk of accidents, the linkage with nuclear weapons and nuclear war, and the problem of production of radioactive waste. So these are all which we would think as undesirable. Then the second set of problems which I talked about is that nuclear power is expensive and cannot be scaled up fast. It's not a feasible solution to climate change. And lastly, the political economy of nuclear power is tightly tied to the political economy of large fossil fuel energy and the larger capitalist system, which I don't think is going to be ever allowing us to solve change. Okay, I think I've sort of exceeded my time. I'll stop here and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ramana. Really impressive, remarkable presentation. It's so varied and rich. We'll now sort of move over to the comments and the questions that have come in the chat box. If you were to, I could either read it out or you could. In case anybody wishes to put in their questions in the chat box, if you wish to actually ask it verbally, please feel free to do so, or you could put them in the chat box and Ramana could respond. I just have one observation. I pass it on to the question in the chat box, which is about France's experience. Ramana, can you hear me and are you audible?
Sorry?
Ramana?
Yeah, I'm hearing you.
Okay, yeah. No, I was just sort of more a comment on France's experience, because France is actually one of those countries that has a very high portion of its capacity as nuclear. I think it's about 76% or so. So
Right.
actually today I was looking at the carbon dioxide emissions of France over the last 50 years,
Okay.
and sort of comparing that with other comparable countries in Europe. I looked at UK and Germany just offhand. And since 1970, of course, there are various reasons why this might have happened, but since 1970, France's emissions have sort of declined by about 31%. I'm not sure what economic growth rates are, but just comparing that with Germany and the UK, just to see if France is, remarkably different. UK's emissions have declined by about 45%, and these emissions since 1970 have also declined by 31%. And in each country's case, there would be different reasons why that might have happened. It's interesting that France doesn't really stand out,
Right.
So just any thoughts about it, and then we could sort of move on to the questions in the chat box. There already are a few. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say one very brief thing about France, which I think, France is an unusual country, and it's not something which I think is reproducible everywhere. But I think the problem for France is, where does it go from here, right? Its electricity sector is relatively low carbon. It's trying to build a new set of nuclear plants to replace some of the old ones. These are proving to be extremely expensive. So the reactor that is building in Flaman will likely be the last reactor it's going to build. So first question is, what is France going to do once its old nuclear plants have to be shut down? The second is, what you will see also about France is that its growth rates in renewables have been extremely low, right? And I think part of the reason has to do with the fact that it's very hard to marry renewables and nuclear power, right? That might seem a bit counterintuitive, but the way to think about it is that nuclear power is works best as what we might call a base load source of electricity. In other words, the power output does not vary very fast. It's not true that they cannot do that, but they're typically not best positioned to do that. And what you really need when you're dealing with intermittent renewables like wind and solar is a source of electricity that can actually be very flexible, that can go up and come down very fast. And things like hydropower or natural gas can do that, as well as batteries and other storage systems. Right? Nuclear power is not really very good at that. Okay? I'll sort of leave it at that. The problem with many of these country questions that they become counterfactuals, which we can sort of discuss forever.
Right. So there are some questions in the chat box, including from Achin starting off. So would you like to read them yourself and respond?
So Achin, I don't want to get into this whole discussion about.
Let's get the question out in case.
Achin, do you want to say your question?
Yeah. So there's a fact that.
Yeah, I mean, no more. I myself only vaguely know what Dali and Pauline and so on are saying it. But go ahead and explicitly.
I had one question which you answered later on, but let me take to the second and third question, which was sorry. Let me just stop. Yeah. Will you say something about the slowness of the nuclear path to addressing climate change, since the same amount of money was directed to renewables, one could reduce emissions much more and more quickly? Yeah. Second question is, leave aside the nuclear energy issue. How likely is it that governments will resort to technical solutions like iron filings in the ocean and sulfur particles on? Because as it gets worse, I'm fearful that this is what they're going to. Do you have any idea of possible side effects? And the last question, of course, is about Daly and Alia and Pauline. So those are really my three questions.
Right. So I think I kind of answered the first question. I mean, I don't think nuclear power can be scaled very fast, and it's not a very good investment if you're going to talk about it as a fixed amount of money that can be invested. Choosing between renewables and nuclear, I think the choice is fairly clear that renewables are a much better investment.
What I'm saying is that, sorry, but my point is that we have to reduce climate emissions quickly. So can this not be a very strong argument against it?
Yes, I agree. It is. I did mention that. That's kind of it was implied in those graphs that I kind of talked about the time of construction and so on. But yes, I think that is definitely an argument against thinking about nuclear power as an important component of the solution, right? Because you're not going to be able to expand the fleet fast enough to be able to come down the emissions curve fast enough. Okay, all right. Your other two questions, I think geoengineering is definitely a concern. And I think the longer we go, as the climate crisis becomes more imminent, I'm sure that more and more governments will be pushing for that kind of a solution. But it will be coupled, I think, with companies that are trying to profit off that, right, in some fashion, right? And the question, I think, what they're trying to do is to figure out what those, how are you going to profit from that, right? The profit can come either because they find some marketable product, which can be, for example, they've tried it with the case of carbon capture and storage, which is to say that we will use it to extract more oil or more gas from old fields, all right, by pumping in carbon dioxide, right? So that's one way by which you can profit. The other way is to get governments to subsidize something of this sort, right? And then you will come back to the same question: should governments be funding money on that or not? And then, of course, the issue which we are all concerned about is we don't really understand the climate system well enough to know what's going to happen if you do all of this. Okay, I think on the issue about I think Rohit is also asking this question. Degrowth and Dali and Alia and so on. That's a long and complicated debate. I think we should sort of not get into that here.
Let's take questions. Yeah.
Sorry, will you promise that you have another Zoom meeting which you will take that up?
I'll call you on the phone and we can talk about it. Okay, other questions?
Yeah, so just going down, this is more a comment from me looking at India's electricity capacity in the last roughly 2.5 years. And notice that wind has gone up, solar's practically more than doubled since January of 2018, and nuclear has stayed exactly where it was at 6780. The 6780 is in my head because I look at this data every month. It's like still at 6780.
So this I have. Yeah, so Naga, I didn't want to talk much about India here, But I've been looking at nuclear power in India for a much longer time, as you know. And what I generally observed is that if you think about nuclear energy as a share of all electricity generated, right, it stayed roughly at 3%. Right, it goes up sometimes, to about 3.5, 3.7% when a new nuclear reactor comes online, and it will decline to 2.5, 2.4 when nothing has been constructed for a while. Okay, it's sort of like the Hindu rate of growth, right? And it sort of stays around 3%, and that's like a constant of nature. So if I have to bet money on it in 2040, what will be? It'll probably be still 3%
of electricity.
Of electricity, yeah.
And electricity is only a very small part of
yes,
energy.
I agree. I usually think electricity terms, but so I see a couple of
So the next question: nuclear share came down in the U.S. after the 3 Mile Island. There's more due to public sentiment rather than any techno setback. TMI was much less damaging than Chernobyl or Fukushima had. Do you want to respond to this?
So I think this is a debate that's happened many times. I'm not convinced that nuclear share came down after 3 Mile Island. In fact, if you look at reactor cancellations, the reactor cancellations trend of utilities canceling orders for nuclear reactors started prior to 3 Mile Island in the late 1970s, because the first wave of reactor construction had become so much more expensive, right? So I think that economics is the driver. I wish that public sentiment is going to be driving nuclear power construction to be stopping, but unfortunately, I don't think energy policy is practiced democratically anywhere, most of all in the United States, right? I wish the policymakers in the United States would listen to the public and actually decide based on that, but they don't. That's unfortunately a sad point.
So this next question actually for me, and I'm completely convinced, Ramana, about the dangers of nuclear power. But then just looking at the numbers between the data that we have, even though it's not very precise, of the deaths from coal each year compared to the deaths, say, from nuclear, and it's an order of magnitude higher for coal. And in practice, when countries have cut their nuclear power, they've very often expanded their coal. So how do they think through this?
So I actually disagree with that proposition. The first thing which I usually say is, this is a question that comes up all the time. So I think, the simple answer is that I don't want either coal or nuclear power, right?
I think Matt, sorry to butt in, Ramana. I think Matt Perry also answered the same way. The point is in practice.
Right.
And
I want to come to that. Yeah. So I want to come to that. Yeah. So if you look at, I think, countries which have shut down nuclear power, so Germany is probably the most well-studied example, and I think I've shared an article which we looked at it. There was a brief spike in the use of coal and in emissions in Germany, and then that has sort of subsequently come down quite a lot, right? So I think the issue is really, if you're thinking about nuclear power and you realize there are some problems with it, we want to phase out both nuclear power and coal, and the way to do that is to try to do this in a planned fashion, essentially, right? And I think that's possible. So in the United States, for example, there have been a number of shutdowns. Most of them are unplanned because and I think for various political reasons. But the best examples are places like California, which has a strong, where the decision to not renew the license for the Diablo Canyon plant was accompanied by a promise from PSEG not to increase emissions and replace it with renewables and energy efficiency and so on and so forth, right? So I think that's possible at this point. 20 years ago, maybe it would have been a harder proposition, but today it's fairly clear. Yeah, I see it. Yeah. Okay.
Anish has a question which you touched upon earlier, but so he says that one argument in favor of nuclear, which is often raised, is that power grids require sources like coal, natural gas, and nuclear, which can provide a baseline of reliable power, which renewables can't. The argument goes that a significant, if minor, level of nuclear power is necessary for the electricity grids of the future. In this sense, it is supposed to be preferable to coal or natural gas playing this kind of roles. How would you respond?
Yeah, I think that there's a complicated technical question about how much we need of inertial power base, but also the question of how technology is evolving, right? So in the debate over whether we need, so just to kind of back up, the argument earlier, maybe 10, 15 years ago, used to be that once you went past about 20 or 30% of renewables on the grid in terms of electricity energy share, then the grid would become unstable, right? And that has changed significantly, right? Now we can see already there are countries like Germany and so on, which have had 40, 50%. Now you can argue that Germany is part of a European grid, but I think that is part of the solution, that the way you deal with the intermittency of renewables is to become embedded in a larger energy system where there's going to be generation in other parts of the system which can compensate for lack of generation in one place. Right? That's the first point. The second is that in terms of studies of the reliability of grids with greater and greater fractions of renewables, the number which I mentioned earlier was about 20, 30% about 10, 50, 20 years ago, is now people are talking about grids of the order of 70, 80, and some even go up to 100%. All right. And I think I've myself done some toy models that suggest that you can do 100%, but this is a toy model, right? And the reason I didn't try to do a full-scale model is that there are so many assumptions that you will have to make about technologies which are fairly far into the future, that at this point, I think all those things should be treated with a great deal of skepticism. All we can sort of really be confident about is the foreseeable future in the next 10, 20 years. And during that period, I don't see any major roadblocks towards expanding renewables. And I don't think that really we can go for all of the, we can sort of answer questions about what is going to happen once you reach 95% of the grid being renewables or something like that. We'll have to, by the time we get there, we'll have a better idea whether you need that little bit of a base load source. The last point which I want to say is that, yes, maybe there is a role for quote unquote base load sources or something which is more stable, but that role can be played by other options as well. Hydro being one, geothermal being another, things of that sort, biomass, etc., etc. But I don't think we should really get fixated on that debate because that is really far away.
So Shalini has a question, and I again repeat, in case anybody wants to come in themselves to ask a question, please feel free to do so. Shalini is mentioning a documentary that she saw 5 years ago and says, it was disturbing to note that we can never really keep the world, and so the environment, safe from exposure to radioactive waste and substances once they are mined. I'd like to hear your thoughts about this.
Yeah, that is definitely true. My friend Felicity Hill once put it very sort of graphically. She said, every time you mine a pound of uranium out of the earth, there are only 3 possible destinations. On a good day, it goes into a nuclear reactor, becomes radioactive waste that stays hazardous for hundreds of thousands of years. And you have to dig some deep hole somewhere and bury it there and hope that nobody ever digs up near there, right? On a bad day, you can have something like Fukushima or Chernobyl. There's an accident and the whole thing comes out as radioactive fallout. And on a really bad day, it can end up as a nuclear weapon that is exploded on top of Hiroshima or Nagasaki and kills millions of people, right? There's only 3 possible ways by which you can deal with uranium through the nuclear fuel cycle. So I think that's absolutely right. There is no good end for that.
Achin has a question which you may have commented on earlier. He says, so do you reject the Daly and Allier approach? What about the Poland approach? Sorry, when any new in this rolls down, the Poland approach about dominant focus on the Green New Deal and growth within capitalism.
Yeah, I don't really buy that argument, but I think we agreed to sort of defer that question to a different time.
All right. Rohit is asking about Monbiot. What does Monbiot say?
So Monbiot's argument, so Monbiot's argument about Fukushima was that he said, look, there was this really bad accident that happened, but if this is the worst case accident, then I'm willing to take it. It's not really so bad, right? And part of the reason why he was saying it was because he was assuming, this was in 2011, that nobody was going to die of Fukushima. And that's because, in turn, was because in the case of Chernobyl, he internalized, or at least he parroted some of the lines about from the Soviet Union's old propaganda about just 30 or 50, I forget the exact number, of people having died because of Chernobyl. The rest of it was just made up by anti-nuclear people and so on and so forth, right? And I think I don't really know what's going on in his mind, but my guess is I think some of the people who are very concerned about climate often end up focusing on nuclear power as a possible solution, because otherwise it's just too depressing, right? The news about climate just gets worse and worse, and then you feel like saying, okay, I need some solution. And some people hang their hat on massive growth in renewables. Other people sort of hang their hat on nuclear power and some combination of that. And I think then they sort of start. It's fine to say, in my opinion, that we don't have any other choice. We need to have nuclear power, but at the same time, take a clear-eyed look at the evidence of the problems with nuclear power. And you can say, look, I'm willing to live with, have some bunch of people live in a contaminated area. I'm personally willing to live. And I'm sure that I'll find another 10 million people who are willing to live in contaminated areas and so on and so forth, which they're not saying that. They basically would say, oh, this is a problem with the past. It's not going to happen again. It's not really so bad. And I think that's somewhat of a disingenuous argument. And this is something which you can, the politics of the health effects of radiation is another talk that somebody ought to give. I'm not the person who's going to give that, but it's a very complicated politics.
So Rohit has a question that sort of takes off from Achin's question. He says, given the absence of a political challenge to capitalism, how do we go from here to there? While degrowth seems like a good ideal to strive towards, but every political objective requires a political strategy. Do we have one? And an analogy is with communism is ideal for Marxists, but how do we go there? Ask Rohit. I'll leave you.
Yeah. I think these are big questions. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do justice to that. I just say something along the lines of, just as in the context of, Marxism and communism and so on, there are these discussions about reform versus revolution and sort of, non-reformist reforms, right? Trying to push for, trying to say no to a whole bunch of things, being a way to force the system to come to terms with the fact of climate change and having to change the ways of production and social interactions. I think that's the way I would sort of think about it. But I don't, these are not, I don't think, easy questions to answer.
Ajmal has a question about Dubai and Saudi Arabia. He asks that Saudi seem to be getting into nuclear recently. What are your comments on this?
So I think the two cases are somewhat different. The UAE, got into nuclear power actually in the mid 2000s, at a point where they thought that we need to find some kind of alternatives to fossil fuels because this is going to dry up at some point. But I don't think they're going to actually go ahead and, they built one plant which finally came online this year. But it's not clear to me that they're going to build anymore, because in the 15 years roughly that it has taken to between the decision to go ahead and build the plant and actually building the plant, they have invested in a whole number of solar plants which have set records essentially in terms of cost, right? And they're really driving, they think of themselves as being the leader in solar power. I don't think that they will be able to build another nuclear plant, right? Saudi Arabia, I think, is a different question, different beast altogether. The Saudis, MBS and various other people have hinted very clearly that they are interested in nuclear power because of its connection with nuclear weapons, right? And it's not so much that they say, oh, we are going to make nuclear weapons, but they say that Iran has nuclear capacity. Iran may be able to make nuclear weapons. If they are going to be in a position where they're even seen as having the prestige value or the the sort of club value of belonging being able to do this kind of stuff, then we need to be in the same arena, right? So this is really their reason for building nuclear power plants, not because they are running out of oil or they're really interested in climate change and mitigation or anything of that sort.
Mayank has a question. Before I read his question, I just want to say that in case I miss any questions, people please come in and ask. The reason being is that when anybody sort of adds a question, it sort of scrolls down all the way down to the bottom. So it's the point of my going.
Question. I'll grab. It's Matt.
Matt, yeah. Why don't you come in?
Let the Matt ask his question.
Yeah, okay. Matt, why don't you come in? And
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. Can you give me a quick answer on your views on TerraPower, the Gates Foundation thing with this two new technologies that they're claiming? I'm thinking more of options potentially for 100-year or 200-year solutions rather than immediate climate, the next 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. So TerraPower, I think, is a very hazy concept, right? Their design has changed a lot in the last 10 or 15 years. They started by talking about a candle kind of design that has changed over a period of time. They first said they were not going to do any fuel shuffling. Now they're talking about fuel shuffling. So there's a lot of haziness there. But there's a fundamental problem with the TerraPower design. And the fundamental problem is that it is a standard sodium-cooled fast reactor, right? And we've had 50 years of experience with sodium-cooled fast reactors, and there are a number of problems with that kind of technology. The first is that because they are fast reactors, they are prone to a certain kind of accidents which don't afflict other kinds of nuclear power plants, so-called the core disassembly accidents, which have to do with how the core configuration, when it changes, the reactivity changes, and there's a positive feedback. The second set of problems with fast reactors, which are sodium-cooled, is the use of molten sodium, right? This is the problem with molten sodium, is that it kind of corrodes away and has certain kinds of reactions with the alloys that are used in these nuclear plants. And there is no reason to expect that TerraPower is not going to have that problem, all right? The last thing I would say is that Bill Gates goes around all over the world saying, this is the great solution, we should be doing this, right? He has all the money in the world. Why doesn't he build one? And the answer is he will not do that because he doesn't think of this as a really feasible thing, right? What he does, he will spend a few $1 million on this, and then he goes to Washington, D.C. or to Beijing and say, you guys should invest the rest of the $1 billion that we require to develop this design to license it, all right? There is no reason to expect, if you look at the history of fast reactors, there's no reason to expect that you're going to be building them at anything like the rate that other reactors are being built even. So the best example is the prototype fast breeder reactor that is being built in India, in Kalpaka. When the construction started in 2004, they said it was going to be coming online in 6 years, 2010, okay? A year after construction started, they said, we are making such good progress, we will actually be earlier than the deadline, right? And it is now 2020, and they're talking about bringing it online maybe by 2022 or late 2021, okay? That's the kind of time delay that you've seen with fast reactors around the world. And this is not, and it's true in China, it's true in Russia. So I have no reason to be confident that the TerraPower design is going to work, all right? And, if, as I said, if Bill Gates thinks it's going to work, he should go ahead and spend the, roughly $1 to $2 billion you need in order to get it licensed, right? Instead of going around preaching about it and sort of pretending as though he doesn't have the money to pay for it.
Thanks for the answer. I'd just like to make a comment. When I personally saw you starting to talk about weapons, and you used a picture of, I don't know what his name is, but the Iranian president, I kind of felt that was a little bit of a divisive picture. If you're going to talk about weapons, why pick Iran? It seemed a bit fear-driven.
I think that's, I will explain why. And I mean, it's not so much that it is Iran per se. I think, there are 9 countries which are far worse. I don't think Iran is actually owns and has any nuclear weapons. My own position is I'm not even sure they are interested in nuclear weapons. However, the reason I used that picture, and I didn't have time to talk about it, is that it is in the context of Iran that this debate has been most pronounced, where the hypocrisy is kind of most evident, right? So when Iran's nuclear enrichment activities became knowledge, when people got to know about it, when this breakaway group sort of had this press release in Washington and so on, the US response to that was very interesting, which is that they would say, look, we don't, on every other place they would say, oh, it is perfectly safe because the International Atomic Energy Agency is there, etc., etc. With the Iranians, they would say, oh, we don't trust them, right? So with the Iran, you cannot even have a screwdriver because they don't trust them, right? So it is very hypocritical, but it tells you what it means to think about nuclear power as a solution to climate change, which is that if you really were to think about nuclear power as being a potential solution, the places where it really has to expand is in a large number of developing countries where energy required needs are going up rapidly, right? So you would have to have nuclear plants in Indonesia, in Nigeria, in a whole bunch of other countries. And you can just about imagine how people in Washington and in London are going to react when all of these people are going to get nuclear power, right? So as long as they're friends, it's all fine. But the moment it's no longer them, suddenly nuclear technology becomes dangerous and hazardous, right? And I think that hypocrisy is very important. That's actually why I put that slide.
Okay. It did a good job. Thank you.
Mayank is a question, Ramana, on nuclear power in India. So you said that the number of nuclear power plants plateaued around 2013-14, and China played an important role. I assume it means the expansion. So will you please elaborate? I had an Ramana about China, which is that looking at a lot of worldwide data, and I think China is the only country in recent years where there's been a significant expansion. Most other major countries sort of been in decline. So what actually drives this expansion of nuclear power in China? And is it in the public sector and so on?
Yeah. So what's driving in China is essentially two things. One is, again, I don't, I want to speak too confidently, but I'll tell you what I know of that place. The first is that in China, there are decisions are made by these large public sector companies, the CNNC and CGN, the China National Nuclear Corporation, and the China General Nuclear. And these state-owned enterprises essentially drive a lot of these decisions. And sometime in the first decade of the century, as China became seen as a problem in the climate change world, they decided that their answer to this is going to be nuclear power, right? And then I think around the same period, there was also another factor that sort of grew in China in terms of decision making, which was the problem of air pollution, right? And for a change, it was not people in the rural parts of China who were suffering. It's actually the elites in the cities. And so then the Chinese leadership had to be seen as doing something. And nuclear power was one of the things that they could say, oh, we are doing this in order to mitigate climate change, or to reduce the problem of air pollution. Once these groups had sort of got in place and started going, they start finding reasons for building more and more nuclear plants. I think what happened in China was that after Fukushima, they have changed tack. And the Chinese national leadership is no longer as supportive of nuclear power as they have been in the past. And which is why I think China was one of the few countries which actually took a longish break in terms of nuclear power construction after Fukushima. Unlike United States, unlike India, unlike the UK and so on and so forth. But it's sort of, there's a lot of internal domestic politics that's happening between very powerful organizations, kind of the way capitalism operates everywhere. But this is sort of with a Chinese twist, as it were. And of course, China has capacities which are different from anywhere else, right? We saw that, for example, most recently last year, when they built that hospital in Wuhan in record time, when the COVID epidemic first broke out there, right? That's not something which other countries are able to do. And so in a way, China is able to do certain kinds of construction projects in a way that's different from every other place. So they are kind of special, but I think there is profound uncertainty about the future of nuclear power in China, and it's not going to be the driver for or the rescuer for nuclear power.
Right. Before we go on to any the remaining questions, just sort of two brief comments. One is I must apologize that we have certain technical constraints, so the recording may stop any time, or it may already have. So in case any of you wish to take notes of whatever remains, please do so. And secondly, for future talks, please put your email in the chat box, or email us at teachersagainstclimatecrisis@gmail.com. Now, moving back to questions, Achin has a question, which a point of view that's also been voiced by a number of other people like Ashish Kothari and others. Do we not need more decentralized production and distribution energy, which nuclear energy can't do?
So, that's a interesting question. I think that nuclear is less prone to being constructed in a decentralized fashion, but people talk about these small reactors and micro reactors and so on, which are going to be even more expensive. But the higher expense is sort of also similar in the case of, let's say, solar, right? So utility scale solar plants with large solar farms are going to be cheaper than rooftop solar, right? So I'm not sure that's really a very strong argument. Nuclear power has historically been centralized. There is no inherent reason why it cannot be decentralized. But I don't think that it will make even as much economic sense as it does now if it is decentralized.
Right.
Okay, see, Sahadevan has a question about could you make...
Before we go to that, I was going to say, Prabhu seems to have a number of observations. Prabhu, do you want, if you're there, Prabhu Mahapatra, do you want to sort of convey stuff or these comments or responses? Let's move to Sadevan at the end. I think we're reaching also the end of the list of our questions. Sadevan asked a question. Could you please make a few comments on India's breeder reactor program?
Yeah, so I think the breeder reactor program is one of those interesting sort of vestiges of the past, as it were. The program is sort of way behind in schedule. It has eaten up a lot of resources, not just sort of money, but also in terms of talent and engineering work that the Department of Energy has put in, Atomic Energy has put in. Into developing these technologies, which we know sort of a priori are going to be very problematic. They are also much more expensive. My former colleague Suchitra and I did some calculations around 2009, 2010, where we showed that when you compare breeder reactors with heavy water reactors, the mainstay of Indian nuclear power, breeder reactors are, somewhat 2.5 times more expensive, right? And so there's an obvious question about why is India sort of investing in breeder reactors? And there are, I think, only sociological reasons that I can think of. The most important being that the Indian nuclear program was set up by Homi Bhabha, who had in the 1950s said that this is the path that India should be taking. There's a 3-phase path. India will first build heavy water reactors, and they will transition to breeder reactors, and then there will be breeder reactors using thorium. And that path may have been, sensible at his time, but subsequently we know a lot more about these different technologies that it should have been given up. And that's what happened in most countries around the world. In India, for some reason, within the Department of Atomic Energy, it seems that you cannot advance if you are seen to question the Bhabha vision. And because of that, every leader in the Atomic Energy, the Department of Atomic Energy, will essentially swear allegiance to that particular vision, whether or not they really believe in it. And I think the one time when this issue was questioned was during the U.S.-India nuclear deal and the whole debates between 2005 and 2008, where for the first time you saw a division within the nuclear establishment. One group saying we need to import nuclear power plants and thorium and so on are really not going to happen anytime in the near future. And the other group saying, no, 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 we've always maintained our faith in breeders and thorium, and that's what we should be focusing on. And in the event, what has happened is that the nuclear deal went through, but the group that was pushing for imports of nuclear reactors never saw any reactors being imported, right? And the breeder people have been struggling with the breeder reactor. And I mentioned already during the discussion how the prototype fast breeder reactor has been so delayed. It's been delayed because there have been a huge number of problems with sodium leaks and pumps and all kinds of things. And so it's, I think, going to essentially a dead end that the DAE is sort of pursuing. I don't expect it to ever grow very fast, but it's also not going to go away. It's one of those unfortunate things that's going to stay on. Okay.
So just one, I think we reached the end of the list of questions in the chat box.
Mm-hmm.
I just sort of like to hear thoughts about sort of the anti-nuclear movements and particularly elsewhere. I mean, as you know, in India, there have been some fairly vibrant movements in recent years, and they're particularly sort of been growing since Fukushima, in Jaitapur, in Kudankulam, in Madhya Pradesh, in Chutka, and so on. What's the state of sort of the anti-nuclear movements, Ramana, elsewhere outside India, and how's that been, and how you see that going forward?
So I think the anti-nuclear movement is, I don't want to sort of say too much about the state of movements in India. You guys are all there. I'm sort of sitting, across the seas, as it were. And I don't want to make sort of too many comments on that. But I will just say one thing, which is that usually there are two things we have seen historically, which is that typically when there is a protest movement, and these protest movements have been there in India since the 1980s, at least since the reactor construction started in Narora, and then subsequently in Kakrapar, in Kaiga, and then Kudankulam. As well as a couple of movements in Kerala. Sahadevan can speak much more about that, which were among the few that were actually successful, both in Bhutangat and in Peringom, as well as in Horipur in West Bengal, where projects that were proposed were cancelled. But in the most cases, what typically happens is that, as in the case of Kudankulam, the state reacts by just brute force, right? Crackdown essentially. And what usually happens in those cases is that people are arrested, people leave the place, and then there is a kind of, once the reactor construction starts, once the reactor starts operating, there's a new group of people, the existing people start becoming involved in various economic relationships with this particular reactor. Those people whose livelihoods have been lost essentially have to leave and move off to the cities or some other place. And so the movement kind of is dwindled pretty naturally, right? So it's only when new construction starts that we might expect to see these kinds of movements becoming vibrant again. And for better or for worse, we've not had that much of construction happening at this point. Right? All the construction has been typically in sites where there are already nuclear plants. Kakrapar, in Rawatbhata in Rajasthan, and so on. Jaitapur hasn't really happened. There was one proposal to have one in Miti in Gujarat that got cancelled. And in Andhra, there is nothing that's really happened. So it's really at a sort of stage where there is not a lot of incentive to go out and protest. There are going to be a bunch of them when the sort of in Madhya Pradesh, in Chutka, and so on and so forth, which you might get to see in the future. The second thing which I want to say is that I think there is a change in the way the Indian government has been pushing for nuclear power. The Manmohan Singh government was much stronger in its advocacy for nuclear power as compared to Modi, right? For better or for worse, Modi is not being so forceful in his advocacy. Right? I think it's partly because he doesn't see it as conferring any great political advantage to him. Right? That's my reading of that. Right? And he sees sort of solar energy and so on as much more conducive to his PR image, if you like. So anyway, because of those circumstances, I don't see that as being a major sort of driver. Now, I think this is a huge problem when it comes to the anti-nuclear weapons movement, because the nuclear weapons are still there, but it's very hard to get people to be active about that because those things are typically, out of sight and out of mind.
With that, I think we've come to an end of a fascinating presentation and discussion. Thank you, Ramana. That was
Thank you,
incredibly.
it was a pleasure.
Thank you, particularly for coming in at what is quite late at night for you. And I do hope that Indian nuclear numbers stay at 6780 for a long time. Don't go up.
This year it will go up. The Kakrapar, first of the Kakrapar has become critical. So it will go up a little bit, but not by much.
Yeah. Apparently they plan 6,000 megawatts in the next 6 years. Awesome. That's right. Yeah. But once again, really, thank you very much for a very rich.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all of those who come in. Our next talk in our series would be, I think, 7th of September, and we'll send those invites out. So once again, thank you very much on behalf of the Teachers Against the Climate Crisis group. Yeah.
Thank you, Ramana. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ramana.
Thanks, Sachin. Bye. Bye, Naga. Bye, Naga.
Bye, Ramana.